Welcome to Broad Eye, the podcast that explores knowledge gaps in ophthalmology and eye care. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Broad Eye podcast. My name is Sean Maloney, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Bruno Fernandez. Bruno, thanks for joining for the episode.
Pleasure to be here again, my man.
Good. And we're here today with Dr. Flavio Rezende. Flavio, thanks for joining us today as well.
Thank you guys for the invite.
It's our pleasure. So you have a pretty robust and impressive background in ophthalmology. I was hoping maybe you could just share with our audience, let's say, the highlights of your career or what took you from starting out in medicine to where you are now. Just a brief overview so people know why you're here today.
Okay. First, I very much appreciate the opportunity, the invite. Yes, so I'm originally from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I grew up in a family of ophthalmologists. So my father, my sister, my brother-in-law. Before coming to Canada, we had a private practice in Rio de Janeiro. So first time I came to Montreal to do my final training in ophthalmology. So I did medical school and ophthalmology residency in Rio de Janeiro, and then I came for my PhD at McGill. And then I did my surgical retina training at McGill and ocular oncology at McGill. So I spent 3.5 years in Montreal. Then I went back to Brazil, practiced with my family for 6 years, then moved back to Montreal, and I've been here for the past 12 years now. And I did my postdoc at the University of Montreal. So now I'm the head of the department at Maisonneuve-Rosemont Hospital, and I'm part of the retina team from University of Montreal. So I'm a vitreoretina surgeon, very much involved in the very cutting edge technology in surgical retina. We're also involved with many what we call translational research and clinical trials research. So every research that we do, the final end is the patient. In our research unit, we actually have discovered and developed molecules that we're actually now testing in humans in clinical trials. So there's a lot of things going on, and many hope for patients who have lost or are losing their vision.
That's great, man. That's very exciting. And one of those cutting edge technologies that I know you've been involved with was the retinal implants, right? Which basically brings back the vision to patients that have lost it. And of course, this is very exciting, but it doesn't seem to have progressed much. Can you talk to us a bit about what it is and what's the current state of this technology?
Right. So yes. So for the general population, they like to call it the bionic eye. So it's pretty much a chip, like a computer chip of some sort, that we implant somewhere inside the eye. It's connected to a specialized glasses, and then there's a little pocket-sized computer that process the information that you carry around your belt or in your pocket or in your purse, and that processes all the information coming in. So I think that the first thing that is important for the audience to understand is the current state of technology. The retinal implants or the bionic eye, they are at the quality of the image. It's more for end stage diseases. So this means that people who are already blind, totally blind, or nearly blind. But it's not for any reason of blindness. Blindness, it's caused by many different diseases. So the retinal implant they still need a part of the retina and the optic nerve that will connect the eye to the brain to be still functional. So this is actually one of the limitations, because there are many diseases, like including glaucoma or retinal detachment or diabetes, that either the optic nerve or the entire retina are compromised, and unfortunately they are not candidates for this type of technology. So uh, you know, we were involved with two different projects. One that was Health Canada approved, and we actually implanted in a few patients with various type of successes. And the biggest challenge is that it requires a total different learning of what vision means. So you know, it's the holy grail for us is to try to learn the messaging process from the eye to the brain. And so we were connecting electrodes that were stimulating retinal cells to send the information to the brain. But actually what the patient sees with this kind of technology, it's pretty similar to those old neon signs. And when you get close to them, it's only like dots of light that they are connected together, and then you see things written out of it. So they're pretty much black and white, you know, what we call phosphenes that connected itself, and then they have to understand each image that they're aiming their glasses towards. They have to process this and connect the dots, if you will. So that's, you know, so these would be the retinal implants. So there's still some companies working with some variation of this device. Currently, there are no companies there in Canada that are doing this anymore, unfortunately. So the one that we had access to, a second site, they no longer produce their retinal implants. But there is, they team up with another company that they are on clinical trial nowadays. So this is to be seen in the near future. We also had the experience of working with a team from Australia, which is the one that Dr. Natalia Vila was involved as well. They actually, the group, they had their own, what they call the next generation retinal chip that supposedly would give a much higher definition of images. And they reach out to us because we were one of the centers in Canada for the retinal chip implant to develop a surgical technique for them. So we did that at the Maisonneuve Rosemont Hospital, and so we designed a surgical technique for them. But there were some unfortunately, some company issues there that they discontinued, they closed down the company as well. So the current state of retinal chip implants is there's one trial going on in the US. The company is called Pixium, and that's where we are right now. So the second site company that had approved the retinal chip implant, now they're currently working on a brain implant, which the only major difference is that there are more people that could be eligible for this implant. But obviously, there's no longer is involved a retina surgeon for it. It's a brain surgeon. And the unfortunate part is that apparently the definition of images, it's exactly the same as the retinal chip that they have. So there's not a much difference in terms of the image quality than what we had so far.
So it sounds like the retinal implants, like you're saying, are really targeting certain ocular diseases and maybe some of the degenerative retinal diseases, but only to a certain point because they need to have some residual retina left. And then the cortical implants seem to say, well, let's bypass the retina altogether, and that's why you can have more potential candidates. Is that correct?
Right. So yeah, exactly. So the targeted diseases of the retinal implant was mainly the diseases that were destroying the photoreceptor cells, so the cells in the retina that actually capture the light that comes through the pupil. So all the other cells, they had to be working for the technology to work.
So it seems now that if someone is not that far along, I guess, in their progression of a degenerative retinal disease, for example, these implants are not ideal for them, and it seems like the field is moving a little bit more toward the cortical implants. So, as an earlier stage intervention, I wanted to talk a little bit about gene therapy because there's certainly a lot of buzz around gene therapy and ocular diseases, and certainly the eye is a very accessible organ for gene therapies.
Right.
So could you talk a little bit about what gene therapy is? If you had to explain this to a patient, which I'm sure you've had to do on numerous occasions, how would you explain gene therapy to your patients?
So before getting to gene therapy, it as the knowledge of diseases evolve, that's what allowed us to migrate towards gene therapy. Okay, but it's pretty much on the other end of the spectrum of the retinal implants. So gene therapy, for it to work, so we are replacing a damaged gene through different technologies. We're learning a lot about this with the current COVID vaccines and stuff. You know, more and more people are aware of these kind of technologies, if you will. But they actually are replacing the damaged gene. But the more advanced the disease, the less likely the gene therapy to work for you, because there's very little rescue of the damaged cells. The idea here, it's exactly the opposite of the retinal implants, which means it's for prevention of progression of the disease. So the earlier detection, the more beneficial would be the gene therapy. And in between these two technologies, being let's say the gene therapy on the earlier stages and the retinal implant on the late stages, we have two other important technologies. One is called the optogenetics, which is a kind of a combination of gene therapy and some external hardware that you have glasses that will stimulate the changed cells that are still remaining in the eye. And you have the cell therapy, which is what we know as stem cell treatment. So there's more damage than the usual candidates for gene therapy, but less damage than the usual candidates for retinal implants.
All right, man, that sounds exciting. Like, so talking about candidates for gene therapies, like, what are the ocular diseases that can be treated using gene therapy?
Right. So there's a group of diseases there. It's called inherited retinal dystrophies. So these are diseases that some gene came out wrong, and there are a multitude of diseases of changes in your gene that can generate vision loss. But they're mostly gene therapies being developed nowadays are for damaged photoreceptors or retinal pigment epithelium cells, which are, let's say, one of the support for the photoreceptor cells. So the great majority of gene therapies are aiming these conditions. So conditions that either the photoreceptor cells are dying or the retinal pigment epithelium is dying. And between these two cells, it's where it happens what's called the visual cycle. So it's where the information, the light that it's coming inside your eye is processed into a nervous stimulus, and will send the information to the brain, and the brain will interpret as image. But this is also important for people to understand. So if you are, so from the time that your photoreceptors capture the light and transformed into a information, a visual information, before it reaches the brain, it connects to the visual part of the brain, which is called the visual cortex. It interacts with many other parts of the brain that will, help you, like when you see a food, you already attach the image of a food with a certain smell. So, just to name one example. So if you stimulate directly your visual cortex with a visual implant, you may lose these kind of interactions that force, there's a reason why the eye before reaches the brain, the visual cortex is the very back part of the brain. So there's a big pathway to go from the eye to the visual cortex. There's a reason for it. It's because there's all this other interactions of other senses that we have that are attached to vision, to the point that some the people some people who have no vision, they are blind, they have their auditory system, so their hearing, it's much improved because they take that part of the brain they use for their hearing. So it's all interconnected. So, and that's why I still prefer therapies that are focused on the retina and the optic nerve versus a brain implant.
It's interesting the example you're talking about. I never really thought about the idea of the signal having to pass from the retina at the front of your head to the visual cortex at the back of your head, and
Right.
and these other potential interactions. It just made me think of a story I read about a guy who had his corneas replaced. He had some chemical burns in his corneas as a 2 or 3 year old boy, and I want to say it was 40 years later or something like that, where he had these corneal transplants and he was able to quote unquote see again, but the objects that were in front of him, he didn't know what they were. Like he had to touch this cereal box to realize, oh, that's actually a cereal box. It wasn't, he had to relearn to see, even though he was able to see some images.
Yeah.
He didn't know what it was until he had to touch it, smell it, and experience with the other senses. So it's it just kind of brings up that thought.
This was something that was part of our recruitment process for the retinal implants. So there was one particular patient that received one of our implants. She told me, she said, I know I'm going to do well with this because I can see. And she meant by she had a visual memory that was very alive. So for the audience, for people who have visual impairment, it's very, very important for you to practice in your brain let's say, what an apple looks like, what a banana looks like, what a bottle of water looks like. Because, whatever therapy in the future may help you, you need to have that, visual memory going, because that's how you will perform better. And that's usually something that it's very little, very little people talking about it, because it's a bit abstract if you don't have this kind of experience with these therapies for end stage diseases. These were patients that were blind for years before we put the implant in their eyes. So
it's an interesting topic, right? That people don't often think about. So I'm just curious what you would identify as some of the primary obstacles or challenges for advancing gene therapy for these ocular diseases, or maybe more specifically these inherited retinal diseases. So,
Yeah.
and when I say obstacles, I mean, in the research lab or as a clinician or, for industry that are trying to develop these therapies, it's not quite as simple as, oh, hey, I have a gene that I'm going to replace, and here's a vector and shove it in the eye and boom. Because if it was that simple, then this would have been happening, years ago. I think it boils down to how, big that gene is or whatnot, but
Right.
maybe you can elaborate on some of those challenges.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to the situation that we are nowadays with the pandemic. The technology that is being used, and the speed of the progression of the vaccines that are being offered to in Quebec. It's an unheard of speed of building something that is not very far from gene therapy, and it's going like what we like to say from bed to bench side and like really quick. So I believe that this will open a new era of gene therapy treatments that will come to patients sooner. And the reason why I'm saying this, because the biggest challenge is that each mutation nowadays, so these, to begin with, these are rare diseases, okay? So there's not a lot of people carrying each one of these mutations. So as a whole, it's the big group that we call retinitis pigmentosa. Uh, Inside this, group of diseases, there's a whole bunch of different mutations that will end up destroying the photoreceptor and the retinal pigment epithelial cells. But each mutation and each type of gene therapy, because there's different types of approaches for one single type of mutation, um, they each one have to be tested separately for clinical trials. So the speed that this, like for instance, right now there's around, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere between 60 clinical trials for different types of gene mutations, all for inherited retinal dystrophies. Um, so each one of them are being studied separately. So and it's a delay that, the essence of gene therapy, that meaning that has to be, offered to the patient early on in their disease, it's, not allowing a lot of patients to benefit from it because of the whole process. So I'm hoping, I always like to see on the bright side. So I see the bright side of this awful pandemic is will help, people who have inherited retinal dystrophies at some point to have quicker access to gene therapy.
All right. So just to be clear, if I understood correctly, like so for a patient to be a candidate, like I mean, for this kind of gene therapy, like having the target disease, it's not enough, right? Like I mean, we need to know if the patient also has the mutation. So in that case, genetic testing seems to be like a key step, right? Like I mean,
Right.
for the patient to eventually enroll and benefit from this therapy. Is that right?
Exactly. So this is it. So that's where we're hitting a new wall that before wasn't considered a wall. So people who had these diseases had no treatment for it. So the great majority of patients don't even know which kind of mutation they have, and many times they didn't even have an ophthalmological follow-up because they simply said, well, there's nothing to be done in my case, so why bother? So there's a lot of people now that are hearing about, oh my God, whoa, there's this, am I a candidate? So we won't be able to know if someone is a candidate for gene therapy if we don't know their mutation. So now we're trying to educate, and I thank you for the opportunity in this space to talk about it. So we're trying to educate ophthalmologists, optometrists, and patients in general that have these inherited retinal dystrophies or retinitis pigmentosa as a whole, to contact their ophthalmologist back, or to seek out for so we had the honor to be chosen to be one of the first sites in Canada for the newly approved first gene therapy treatment in Canada. Name of the drug is called Luxturna, and it focuses in a specific mutation that it's called RPE65 mutation. Okay, so one of our retina specialists in our hospital, named Dr. Cynthia Kian. So she is a retina surgeon and a retinal dystrophy specialist. So she, she's trying to put out a task force to have people who have the diagnosis of retinal dystrophy or retinitis pigmentosa to have their gene identified to see if they are actually a candidate for the current approved treatment. And well, what if they're not? It doesn't matter. At least you already know what is the mutation that you have, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of studies going on right now that may soon be related to the mutation that you have that caused your visual deficit. So we will provide a phone number to contact Maisonneuve-Rosemont Hospital, specifically for the goal of seeing Dr. Cynthia Kian, to allow us to test the genes and see what are the mutations, and if it's the proper mutation, eventually the patient can be a candidate for gene therapy already available now in Canada.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because like we are so used to see like patients trying to find a treatment, and in this case, it seems that there's a treatment trying to find its patients, right?
Exactly.
So we
we are there's I see this as a revolution. Okay, so that probably gene therapy is going to be the biggest medical revolution of our times. So this is only the first, it's the first approved in Canada altogether as a gene therapy. And it was great because, although the current approved treatment is for a mutation that is not very common, but it was very successful in treating the patients that do have this mutation. So now, based on the success of this technology, many other ones are following, which are more complex treatment, but for a more frequent mutations. So, and that was probably one of the barriers for the retinal implants, is that the first implant that was out there didn't perform as well as the first gene therapy that is out there, if you will.
that's very exciting. So we're definitely gonna post the ways of contacting you and your team, like
Right.
in the description of this podcast, and on our social media channels as well. Sean, do you have any other questions for our
Yeah,
guest?
well, I have about you've got about what 6-7 hours you can sit and answer my questions, right?
Right.
No, I mean, obviously this is of paramount importance to me as well. I mean, I'm a co-host of this show, but I'm also a patient that is legally blind from retinitis pigmentosa. So
Right.
I had the luxury of going to the National Eye Institute back in 2009 and participating in a project there where I was able to, they were able to identify the mutation causing RP in my family.
Mhm.
But I think it's great that there's more of this going on, this
Right.
this genetic testing, and hopefully this will be one of the channels to kind of get that information out there for everybody.
Right, and so there's a lot of things involved with this, like one of important, questions of families, as you mentioned, family, is that these mutations, a lot of them are carried on, passed along, the siblings, and so and there are different disease severity. So some are, many are diagnosed early on in their childhood, but there are some that they only appear later on in life. And for these ones, sometimes you're passing along a defective gene that you don't even know that you're passing along. So as we're starting to provide, gene testing, um, we are also are planning to provide gene counseling, which is also as important, if not more important sometimes, to educate people what to do, depending on the mutation. Am I going to pass along to my siblings? Can I have siblings and stuff like that? And what are the risks of my siblings, to get this disease? What are the risks of my other family members to have the same type of disease that I do? And from where the disease came from, in our family. So these are all things that, were left aside until now, that simply because there was nothing else to be done about it. And in fact, hopefully with time, the gene testing will become more simple, because nowadays we still have to ship to the US to be analyzed, the samples. Novartis Canada, they are the ones that had the recent approval for the first gene therapy, and they are the ones that are helping us out with gene testing the patients that do have a diagnosis of retinitis pigmentosa, to see if they can be eligible for the treatment, the approved treatment. It's also important for the audience to understand, this is not a research project. This is already an approved drug by Health Canada.
I just have one follow-up question that I mean, I have 100, but I'll throw one that comes to mind as a patient. So I've gone through that testing. I know the mutation. It's an RPGR mutation that I have in my family now, but I have other family members who are affected, but have never gone through genetic testing. For them to be included in future clinical trials, is it sufficient, or in general, is it sufficient that they have a family member with a known mutation, or will they also have to undergo genetic testing before they could ever qualify for any of these clinical trials or treatments?
No, each one has to have their own testing, because depending on the type of treatment, like for instance, this RP65 treatment that we are providing now, you have to have both genes affected. And you cannot know this just by another member of your family having the tested gene. So you don't know if you receive both genes or only one gene. And that's why also there's different, in the same family, there's different spectrum of disease expression. Some, relatives can have very low vision, while others have very minor visual impact from the same mutations, just that they don't have both genes affected, or it's not as expressed as it is in one other family member. So no, each one have to have their own gene tested.
Oh, great. So listen, Flavio, we could sit and chat with you all day long, and maybe hope we can get you back for a round 2 at some point, because I think you have a lot of experience and insight that the audience can certainly benefit from. So I just want to take a moment to thank you for participating in the show today, and that we will be linking to the different resources in the show description. So the contact information for anybody who wants to reach out to apply for the genetic testing at the hospital in Montreal. And if there's anything else that you want us to add, of course, we'll add that in there. So just thanks for taking the time to chat with Bruno and I today.
Thank you very much, Sean and Bruno, once again for the invitation. And I'd like to congratulate you guys in what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Flavio.
Bye-bye, guys.
And that concludes today's episode of the Broad Eye Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Of course, ratings and reviews are always welcome. And you can certainly share this episode with any of your colleagues or friends who might enjoy it. Thanks for listening.